Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with sports psychologist Professor Robert Schinke. Rob, welcome. Great to see you.
It's just been an absolute delight to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah, we've been trying to do this for a little bit of time. I'm excited, but I'm also honoured because I've known of you and your work. I mean, you're a famous person in our circles in the world of sports psychology and across sport. So I'm really looking forward to speaking all things sports psychology with you. You've got a book out, Gifted, that we're going to be speaking about, and we're talking at a time where the Olympic Games has just finished, so we can unpack all of that and we can go in lots of different directions. So looking forward to it. But before we do all of that, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Yeah, and this whole journey into sports psychology began when I was an athlete. And I was a junior athlete. My stepfather was my coach, equestrian, 3-day eventing. And so I landed up competing at a provincial level and then a national level and then a junior national team and junior World Cups. And then eventually onto the senior national team, competed at a major games, the Pan American Games, and that was in 1987, and was shortlisted several times in between 1986 and 1992. I had an IOC qualification for an Olympic Games, and that was Barcelona, and came really close to qualifying for Seoul, the previous Olympics, and my horse fell about 50 meters from the end of the cross-country finish line. So that was my experience in sport. Over the course of my athletics, I was very inconsistent. Sometimes I'd be at the top of my game and I'd beaten a number of Olympic medalists, and other times I'd be inconsistent domestically, and I couldn't figure out what it was exactly that was contributing to those fluctuations in my performance. I was nervous, inconsistent, lacking in confidence. And then I started to read about sports psychology, and particularly some of the writings of my colleagues here in Canada. Terry Orlick was the quintessential name of the time, and started reading In Pursuit of Excellence, and Jerry Lynch, who's in the United States, and started reading his work on Taoism and sport. And then I got hooked into sports psychology. And when I retired, I was the youngest member of the Canadian equestrian team. I retired at age 24 and went back to graduate school. I was the whole time I was on the national team. I was a full-time student as well at university. Had 2 undergraduate degrees, and so I went back to graduate school and was fortunate enough because Terry Orlick pleaded my case to permit me a qualifying semester in graduate school, and I ended up doing extremely well, and then went on to a doctorate and a postdoc in positive psychology, and then moved to northern Canada, about 500 kilometers north of Toronto, and took a position there. But from the point of my retirement through my doctorate, I was working with various Olympic teams, which sort of plays to your point about what went on with the Olympic Games. And one of those teams happened to be the shooting team. Another one was figure skating. Another one was boxing. And boxing was where I carved out a lot of my applied work over the course of 25 years, from the latter parts of my doctorate through to the end of the Tokyo Olympics in 2021, where I worked with amateur sport for 8 Olympic cycles, and also with HBO and Showtime professional boxing, so World Championship boxing, all of that period. When I was working with those athletes, what happened was I was working with a lot of diversity. And you probably heard of the term cultural sports psychology. So cultural sports psychology was a topic that I coined in 2006, leading to a book in 2009. But it was predicated on all of the diversities of the athletes I was seeing. I was working with athletes of color, athletes from Asia, from South America, from Central America, kids from the street, kids with criminal backgrounds, couch surfers, all of this diversity of sexuality, identity, education, all of these aspects. And what I came to find was that the retention of these athletes was variable as a consequence of a lack of cultural understanding on the part of their coaches and on the part of their staff. And there was no such training in sports psychology at the time about the nuances and understanding the identities of an athlete. We all know that people have identities, but really delving into how to connect with an athlete based on their identity in relation to my own as a practitioner. So that then took me into a faculty position from 2002 to 2010. 2011 to 2020, I was a Canada Research Chair in multicultural sports psychology. And all this while, I was working with amateur and professional boxing and UFC and mixed martial arts and professional ice hockey players and those sorts of things traveling the world. Was a past president of ASP in 2014, 2015, became the president of the International Society of Sports Psychology, 2017, reelected in 2021. And I'm the editor of the International Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology and the editor in chief of the Journal of Sports Psychology in Action, which brings us to this discussion.
There's a lot to dive in there on. I'd actually
Yes.
briefly like to take you back to almost to the beginning of your biography there. You spoke about being a competitor there in equestrian sports, and you spoke about the inconsistency that you experienced as a competitor. And before you dived into the world of sports psychology, particularly Terry Orlick and Dr. Jerry Liggs. Jerry's been on the show. And there's some great stuff there. I'm curious to ask, because you retired at the age of 24 and yet you had dived into this stuff. Just if you don't mind me asking, I'm going to sound like a real psychologist here, probing here, but did you not feel at that time you could take advantage of that in Search for Excellence, Terry Orlick's book, this kind of sports psychology world to improve your performance? Or had you really just had enough of the competitive arena?
Well, two things went on. One was that when I was a kid, there was a National Hockey League goaltender who was concurrently, simultaneously a lawyer, and that was Ken Dryden, and he was a six-time Stanley Cup winner in ice hockey, the quintessential goaltender in ice hockey. And I always looked at him from the point of kindergarten onwards and said, I want to do that. I want to be this high performance athlete, but I want to be a student. And I always knew intuitively that I wanted to have those two identities as having a strong education and a professional career beyond sport. And I was always interested in elite sport, and how I was going to straddle those was unknown when I was a child, until I went into high school and started looking at universities and the possibilities. So it was enticing. Now, my introduction to sports psychology and applied sports psychology happened at a team training camp, and it was only a week or two before a major games event, and they had someone parachute in to speak to us. And at that time, too close to the games, that's not the time necessarily to gain an understanding of the application of the science and the practice of sports psychology, because it's a waxed series of skills. You have to work on them, perfect them, make them your own, integrate them, test them in smaller competitions. These are the proximal processes of sports psychology. And yet I didn't have that. So I was doing a lot of these things on my own: mental rehearsal, lying down, going through cross-country events and doing it to music and meditation. And those sorts of things were things I was picking up from books and I was doing intuitively. And a lot of athletes do the mental skills elements intuitively. They also struggle with self-efficacy intuitively and foster their belief intuitively, not necessarily systematically. But I was always sort of in the proximity of the topic, but never really delved into it formally until I said, okay, I really want to get a handle on this, and this is going to be my niche area.
That's really, really interesting. And it's amazing how times have changed. In terms of you on the verge of the Olympic team, you were very, very close. And yet it was 2 weeks prior to a qualifying competition that this mental skills coach was helicoptered through no fault of that coach, I'm sure, but helicoptered in. And as you quite rightly say, that would just be, I definitely feel in very many Olympic associations, that would just not happen now. It would be very much part of the 4-year cycle, wouldn't it?
It would be, and so it should be, right? They're part of an integrated support team, along with a clinical psychologist, perhaps a sports psychiatrist, physiology, biomechanics, nutrition, pedagogy, coaching. All of the pieces tie in together.
You've mentioned multidisciplinary teams there, and this has become so much more normalized now, the sports psychologist being involved. But I'd love to take you back to 1996, which was your first Olympics, the Atlanta Games, where I know for a fact that was a huge shift for us in Great Britain, because we did hopeless. We won one gold medal, and I think it was even the British government that had to intervene and say, no more, we have to do something here. And Team GB was created, and now we're very successful Olympians, but taking you back to that games, where I'm assuming that sports psychology is still very much an emerging discipline. Were you welcomed with open arms? Did you have to work hard with the Olympic sports that you were working in to really try to amalgamate yourself into that team?
What a fantastic question. I remember I was on mission staff with the Canadian Olympic Committee for Atlanta concurrent to working with the shooting team. And I'd already done some work with high performance sports centers and figure skating and in badminton here in Canada. And I wanted to do boxing because of the transition to professional sport. It's not that Canada was iconic in boxing. That's occupied by the Russians and the Cubans. And there's some Team GB far more successful than we are as well. But I kept bringing coffee to the high performance director of boxing in the evenings because we would go back to the mission staff headquarters at the end of each day. And I kept bringing him coffee and we got talking and got to know each other. And I talk about this in my new book, Gifted. And he said, I don't believe in sports psychology. He said, but I'll tell you what, I really like you and I'm going to bring you into a national team training camp with the juniors and give you a shot. And so I went there and I was, unlike my predecessor who was sitting by the pool before the Atlanta games and waiting for the athletes to come to him, I went and ran with the athletes. I was doing sprints with them and I was dining with them and I was hanging out with them and uh, just chatting with them and chatting with the coaches. And I'm a bit of a chameleon in those sorts of environments and have always been so. And so I fit in very quickly and there were some good results. And then I was brought back a few months later to work with the senior national team in 1996. And instantaneously the athletes liked me. And then I was traveling with them. And that was something that they hadn't done. They had brought in athletes for training camps. Uh, from about 1996 through 2003, 2004, there were rarely any sports psychologists traveling. There were few of us, and then we were asked to cover different sports where there wasn't any coverage from a mental performance consultant. And so we stepped in and did that. I was on medical staff at certain games as well. And now, yet every national team, it's normalized. But that's 25 years ago. It's not that long ago that it was so unusual to have a sports psychologist and continuous access that you're now speaking of in relation to an Olympic cycle.
It's really interesting some of the experiences you've had there, and it just demonstrates that for me listening to you, and I still feel this exists even though sports psychology is has been normalized to a degree across sports. You have to be quite nimble if you like. Listening to what you're saying is that you were confronted with somebody who said, well, I don't really believe in sports psychology, but I like you, and it demonstrates, you could say that demonstrates the importance of relationships. Interesting to hear you say that, well, maybe my predecessor kind of held back and just waited for the athlete to come and see that person, whereas I went in and I actually actively involved myself with these athletes. It sounded like you were on the front foot a little bit. You were quite brave and a little bit bold. And again, I'm probably not going to formulate a question here, Rob, but it just makes me think of, we've got to establish relationships and we've got to be respectful of the environment and the language, but and the fact we're not experts, but at the same time, we do have to be a little bit brave and bold sometimes to muck in, don't we?
But it's a matter of power distance. I think a lot of times people come out of universities, maybe now less so than before when I launched in, but we thought that we knew a lot and there was a power distance dynamic going on where you have your PhD or you've completed a graduate education and then there's the athlete, some of whom, in boxing and combative sports may not have completed high school. And so there's that educational distance. And yet there's education that's formal education, and formal education doesn't only happen in universities. There's formal education in relation to sport as well. And we're all experts in high performance sport. The athlete is an expert, the coach is an expert, the the IST members are experts, and we have to recognize that we all bring some expertise to the table. And it's the recognition of these varied expertises and how they might cooperate and converge and intersect that determines the success of the sports psychology in relation to the context and the athletes who you're seeking to support.
What interests me is that it sounded like you had a real passion to work in the world of boxing, and you mentioned there an interest in the career transition from amateur to professional. So maybe you might reflect on that in a second. But you came from equestrian sports that may, if I may say, feel a little bit distant from the world of boxing. I love working in fighting sports myself, boxing, UFC. I came from the world of golf. I was a professional golfer, which is probably equally as distant from boxing and UFC. So, but when you arrived in that world and you were working with Olympic boxers, what were the demands? Was it more sort of a discourse with these fighters around well-being, mental health, career transitions, or was there a lot of performance-related? I mean, it's all performance-related aspects. I understand that, but was it a little bit more sort of mental skills in the ring type scenario?
That was what I was taught to do. And
Mm.
I realized very early when I was working with indigenous athletes and athletes from Latin America and from the streets that the discussions were, I mean, that's a bit of the discussion would be on planning and on debriefing and making sense and fostering a sense of control. And yet the earliest convergences, and this is a bit of a stereotype, as you come from golf, I come from 3-day eventing, the assumption would be that I was affluent or I came from an affluent circle. And yet my parents were not affluent. My stepfather was a coach. We couldn't afford to heat our home with oil. I had to go out in January and cut wood with a tractor and a chainsaw and tea and vodka to stay warm in -40 weather. And those were the sorts of challenges I faced stoking a fire at 2 or 3 in the morning to keep the house warm. These were the realities. And when the athletes came to realize, yes, I had more of an formal education in university, but also some physical hardships along the way. And there were a series of those sorts of hardships. And we could strike, our paths were different, and yet there were parallels in those paths, though I was assumed to be in a faster circle because I was on a Rolex tour eventually. And uh, intersecting with these really affluent people. And yet that was not my origin story. My origin story was not one of affluence, and it was one of hardship and slow incremental improvement and more access to means. But it wasn't where I launched from. And so some of our discussions were about those hardships and understanding them. You know, some of these athletes couldn't afford a cup of coffee, and I remember being a doctoral student and buying some of them coffee at a Starbucks where we would meet, and go for a walk outside of the where the training camp was to get away. And I barely had enough money to buy the 2 cups of coffee. They had no money to buy a single cup of coffee in certain instances. So we weren't that far apart. And so that was what led to relationships where I happened to be a good runner. So I ended up running with the athletes on the road and doing this sort of road work and these discussions. And that's how I got to know their families. I landed up even at the professional level. The final 2 weeks before an HBO event, I was the one who was housed with the athlete in his home after he went down from high altitude training leading up to the fight, and helped manage the athlete's challenges and concerns as he was cutting weight. You know, that final 10 or 12 pounds excruciating weight before a major event. So a lot of what I've done through day-to-day interactions with athletes. So yes, some of it is about planning, and some of it is about profiling opponents, and some of it was about mental skills, and some of it was about transitioning them and preparing them. We have the Olympics now, and some of these boxers are transitioning from amateur to professional sport, and transitions are challenging and they're oftentimes not effective. So I had to really understand the science and practice of how to help cultivate a smooth transition and one that would stick, so that there was some longevity, and then also transitioning in through and onward from a career in sport to what happens next, and that was always part of the discourse.
We talk in sports psychology about the importance of appreciating and respecting individual differences, but it sounds that during that time you possibly already had an appreciation of socio-cultural differences, but it sounds like those experiences through the late 90s into the turn of the century, working with Olympians, working with people from different backgrounds, and as I say, socio-cultural experiences, that cultural landscape came very much to the front of your mind in terms of the importance of it, the pertinence of it in terms of experiences in sport, but also something that you then wanted to go away and study in a deeper manner.
Yeah, things like indigenized motivational practices were things, those were the early parts of my academic career where I was funded uh, by the federal government, was to create a cultural sports psychology relevant to an Canadian Indigenous population where they, instead of using motivational consultants, they were using elders and they were using medicine people and they were using drummers and they were using sacred medicines and they were using such things and we had no idea. And so someone like me assigned to work with say an indigenous boxer from a traditional community would look at me and say that's alien and it's not congruent with my identity and the background that I come with, and you have to come on board and understand the relevance of my history and of what motivates me in order to support the way I am motivated. And so I had to meet the athletes where they were at, as opposed to the athletes constantly being expected to meet the sports psychologist where he, or they are at. And that was typical at the time in sports psychology, even to present for the most part, is there are now courses and modules in cultural safety and along with mental health and other professional practice and such. But they're multicultural approaches, and we still don't fully understand, unless we're really culturally astute, how to meet a client where they're at, and then to take into account our own position and our own privilege and some of the things we bring to the table and some of the challenges we bring to the table.
It's really interesting. So you've mentioned indigenized motivational practices. Did you find, as soon as you said that, I was thinking, how do I draw as a sports psychologist on, say, self-determination theory with relation to that? And you're nodding your head there because, for all those listening in, and I beg your pardon, you're shaking your head there for all those listening in. So you can't then, is what you're saying. It's not intrinsic as such. You wouldn't put that on the intrinsic side of self-determination.
No, because you have to understand that not all athletes are from individualistic cultures, right? And there are variations of individualism, and there are variations along the continuum to
Yes.
collectivism as well. You go to the Far East, different versions of collectivism in China, Japan, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia. But with the Indigenous Canadian athletes, they come from collective cultures. And if the focus is on the individual and the recognition of the individual without taking into account the importance of the community that they're working with, it's a challenge. And here's the rub, is these athletes then come to a sports system in a national team where the programming, the coaching is highly individualistic based on concepts that promote the individual and the individual's confidence and belief. And you don't fully understand the importance when that athlete comes to this new community of a community accepting them. When they're collectively minded, they need to be accepted and they need to be supported by the community. And if there's no support where they've relocated to or transitioned to in an urban center or on a national team, then the host, the people who are taking them on into the sports system and receiving them, are not really welcoming them. And this is the problem with a non-indigenized sports psychology with a person from a collectivistic culture, right? So a lot of the early research that I did was on effective adaptation practices and that they had to be shared. There was a joint responsibility for the sport organization, just as there was for the athlete to learn some of the practices of the sport organization. There was the responsibility of the sport organization, amateur, professional alike, to learn the practices of the individual so that the onboarding process is a successful onboarding process. And this still does not exist in many professional sporting teams where they throw ideas like foods, traditional foods in clubhouses for athletes who are foreigners to that country. And yet the onboarding is tokenism and it's not integrated. And until it's integrated, the integration of the athletes, you might get their bodies, but you're definitely not going to get their full performance and their full attention and their full engagement.
So there's a degree of the governing body, the Olympic Association, the athlete fitting into some of that which the Olympic Association values. At the same time, it's very important, if not more important, for the Olympic Association to appreciate, respect, and fit into the cultural mechanisms that have underpinned this person's early early life and their life in general, is what I'm hearing you say.
No, let me just clarify here because there's a slight nuance here.
Okay,
What I'm referring to is the sport organization. The Olympic, in amateur sport, an Olympic association is an umbrella term
okay.
under which no sport organizations belong. It's the sport organizations that the athletes are being hosted into, and they're the ones that the athlete is working in, training, and competing in, preparing day in and day out. They're not the connection with the Olympic Committee is oftentimes leading up to a major event, but the sport organization is a consistent thread.
And to be fair, that's me. That was my language and my words. So that was my assumption there. Um, But the challenge being that if we're a sport, a governing body, a sport that wants to, let's say, be successful in any kind of games, in world championships, in Canada, it could be the Commonwealth Games, it could be the Olympics or whatever. If we want to, let's use the term own the podium. It must be a real challenge for sports psychologists in your position there to help that competitor who comes from an Indigenous background amalgamate themselves into the climate that they're coming into. You must have to bring in other people within that person's community. There must be sort of quite a lot of mobilization there to be able to get it done.
Yeah, yeah, and let's be clear. It's indigenous doesn't mean indigenous Canadian Aboriginal people. It also means Indigenous people from Haiti, from cultural communities, right? And I've always been able to work with those cultural communities. A lot of my earlier research was actually community based science to practice, where I was working with Indigenous elders and Indigenous medicine people and chiefs and band councils and cultural leaders in these communities. And that was always what differentiated the early research that I was doing from some of the traditional research that was foisted onto a variation of cultures, but it was really cross cultural research as opposed to really delving into what are the nuances and the anchors that these athletes need in order to feel supported when the stress levels elevate and they need to have meaning as they pursue their own version of excellence.
Broad brush question. So, what wins? The scientific intervention that the staff within the sport want the competitor to utilize, or the processes that the competitor uses from their socio-cultural landscape? Which is the most powerful thing?
Origin stories are really powerful, and original traditions and customs are things that a sports psychologist and mental performance consultant, and even coaching staff for that matter, have to really understand when they're receiving an athlete. They have to delve into that. The sameness, a colleague of mine from the United States 20 years ago was talking about treating people the same and that it was conflated with treating people equally. And sameness and equality are two very different understandings. Treating people equally is meeting people where they're at. Now we're meeting. The assumption was that you treat people the same, and it's based on a series of customs that oftentimes are invisible. We're not aware of concepts such as self-determination theory and self-efficacy theory and self-esteem and self-regulation and all these theories and structures of the self are very important structures, and we've implemented them. I've listened to them in Olympic Committee training leading up to major events where consultants and theoreticians were unpacking these individualistic constructs, and I would look around the room and not all the athletes were European origin athletes who would understand the implications of origins of the self. You know, people are tied to their cultural communities, and if the cultural community has more value to them than their own individual pursuit, what happens is they listen to some of these structures, and they're not motivating factors at all.
So, would you say, therefore, you picked up In Search of Excellence sports many
Yeah.
years ago, would you say that some of these generic books and some of these generic articles, of which I write, granted, need to come with a disclaimer?
I think that we have to be careful with any book as a blanket response to a growth potential in an athlete. And I think that people that are coming into our field now, particularly with an awareness, the Me Too movement has really helped it. Our understanding of inclusion has improved. Diversity, equity, inclusion has improved. Where I remember early on, I would submit research on Indigenous people and it would be rejected, and the editor would write me back and say it has no relevance to our readership. It may not have relevance to your readership, but it has relevance to the people your readership are working with. Because the reality is that the world of high performance sport is highly diverse in so many different ways right now, and we have to understand the complexity of identity. So yes, those discussions are important. Those books are highly relevant and highly useful mental skills books, and yet we have to continue to push the boundary. I think we're only at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to motivational knowledge and growth potential.
And so, some of the key messages through a Western lens, the notion of self-regulation, as you say, self-control. You can control your attitude, your effort, your energy, and I can think of those wrapped up in memes and social media. Great, fantastic, but it's recognizing that that is through a Western lens, an individualistic, a tendency towards individualistic environment more so than collectivist environments.
Yeah, and so true is you take a person who's from Western Europe, and this is a gross overgeneralization again. So let me recognize that is not all people from Western Europe are individualistic. It doesn't like people have they might be second generation, third generation coming from a collectivistic culture. It's not that simple. So you got to meet the person where they're at. But a lot of people value like own the podium is an interesting term to me, and yet I've seen a lot of athletes train on a national team or practice professional sport for a year or two and then return to their collective community and give back and enter as a coach and as an administrator, not because they were withdrawing and not because they didn't have motivation. Their motivation was to give back and grow their community, and that was not understood when I was doing applied sports psychology in the early years when we came across people with collectivistic mindsets. It was the value of the self and one's own pursuit of the podium is wonderful, but what value does it have for the people around me? If none, then maybe there's a better way for my skills and my gifts to translate into possibilities for the people that who touch my life and in my cultural community.
On a slightly related topic, but not exactly the same. I mean, you mentioned this term "own the podium." That
Yeah.
it feels like I'm not saying Team GB have used that. I can't remember if they have, but they certainly had something like that. And then it turned into medals and more. The more being the appreciation and the respect for athlete well-being and
Yes.
mental health, and also the more being the notion of them being great role models in life, and just that sport is so much more. There's a participative aspect to it. There's a cultural landscape to it. So I'd be interested, before we move on to your book, I'd be interested to get your thought and feeling for that. Uh, for how things have changed there. I mean, as we said, your first Olympics was 1996. There feels like a slightly more sophisticated approach to competition now. I mean, even seeing the camaraderie of those competing against each other, it doesn't feel as vitriolic perhaps as it used to be, and it doesn't feel like it's a gold medal or nothing, and second place is the worst place to finish. Those kind of very extreme viewpoints. Have you seen a change in those kind of attitudes over the years?
I think a lot of the value toward outcome is still prevalent.
Mm,
Having watched this last Olympics and watching the 100 meters and seeing that wonderful athlete from Botswana,
yeah.
um, after he won and he had a response that he was not the expert on the 100 meter, but there was a lot of trash talking, and there is in a lot of these sports and in professional sport as well. And yet, what I really do like, and where we are moving in the right direction, is this concept of holistic well-being and mental health. And what I mean by mental health is not a response to ill health. That's important as well, and the recognition that people are challenged and people are, all of us at certain times in our life are in a point of strain and in a point of compromise, and that's true. But sport offers that much more. It offers the possibility to explore thriving, and I don't see a whole lot of research and a whole lot of discussion, but there is a bit of a shifting of the gaze now to, okay, what is the thriving person look like? And how could we tap into the potential of some of these Olympians to show some of the characteristics of a thriving individual?
Well, thank you for using that word because, thriving, absolutely flourishing. We've had Dr. Dan Brown from Portsmouth University on the show.
Yeah.
He's done some wonderful work with some Olympic teams on this aspect, not just the thriving individual, but the thriving team around the player as well, around the athlete as well. And, talking about thriving and flourishing, I know this is an area that you're passionate about. I mean, you said you actually had a PhD in positive psychology, so I'm not surprised, but it's led towards this book that you've recently released, Gifted: 8 Steps to Succeeding in Sport, Work and Life. And there you are holding it up, and our audience will have to imagine it. It's an attractive looking book. So
It is. It's neat. It was an interesting process to get beyond. I've written more than 200 peer-reviewed publications and encyclopedias and dictionaries and these sorts of things, and yet they don't really. I didn't feel fully satisfied with doing yet another edited compilation or yet another book that will be read by 600 or 800 people and found in a repository of a library. I think that what we do is so important beyond the athletes that we work with in terms of the lessons we can learn from sport and how those might help with the pathways of people seeking to thrive more generally. And that's what brought me to the book Gifted.
Well, I was going to ask that. It sounds like there's a little bit of frustration on your part. I mean, do you feel? I mean, what an incredible career you've had. I mean, 200 peer-reviewed papers, just absolutely extraordinary and a wonderful achievement. And yet, hearing you, it feels like you're saying, "Well, I really wanted to get a book out there, a popular science book, if you like." And I remember speaking to Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett about this neuroscientist from Harvard. She came on the show, but she's written 2 incredible popular science reads, How Emotions Are Made and 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. And they're wonderful, but she said she had to read 50 popular science books in preparation to learning how to write this book. So I suppose a couple of questions rolled into one. Was there sort of a frustration on your part that you feel there's so much, and I feel the same, there's so much good stuff written in research papers that don't see the light of day that can really help not just sports people, but people in general? And did you have to do a lot of preparation to be able to write something away from sort of the academic text that you would ordinarily write?
It was a different sort of thing that the catalyst for me was I was coming to the end of 25 years of working in Olympic sport, and I had just finished my Canada Research Chair. My university had declared insolvency. We were in the middle of COVID, and I think transitions are such an important thing. Change, growth, quest. All of these things are necessary elements that have to drive each one of us as we go forward. And we have to continuously reinvent ourselves, or in a sense, we wither on the vine, right? So what I felt was at a certain point in my career is I had to. It was less about knowledge translation and more about, okay, what's next and what can I bring? I've got all of these experiences in my head. I've written position stands. I've been a societal leader. I've done these research chairs. I've been to the Olympics. I've been to professional sport. I've done all that. Is the highlight of my life coming to an end? Or can I write other chapters? And if that's the question, what of the people around me? Because I've seen so many academics get to a point where they, as long as they're climbing and moving towards a full professor rank and excelling, they're quite happy. And then what happens is they reach a certain level. And I found this with amateur athletes, I found it with professional athletes. People have found that in the career transition literature as well, is people at a certain level are in maintenance. And when they're in maintenance, they start regressing. They start moving backwards. They start exhibiting feelings where they're not so happy, they're dissatisfied, they're soured, they find themselves in conflict, they find themselves in existential crises. And so what is the healthy thing to do? The healthy thing is not to sit back on your lounger at a certain point in your life and say, that's it, that was my contribution. People have to continuously contribute. We've got significant issues in the society with people who are sedentary, they're with conflict, with people who are dissatisfied in their jobs and they're not really tapping into their potential. And I wanted to tap into mine, but I also felt that we have to continuously grow and search for new possibilities and transition on. And so we have to start having these transition plans. And what are we transitioning toward? Giftedness. We have gifts that are, some of them are curated early in our life, maybe an athletic gift. I had that, you had that with golf. And then there's another one, academic gifts. And you have an inclination towards academics, you got a PhD. I got a PhD. Other people have other possibilities. They don't want to be teachers. They want to be litigators, barristers. They want to be they could be actors, they can be, there's musicians, they could be mathematicians, they could be so many things, but there's a time and a place for everything. And then there's a time where we need to start, as we're still gaining benefits from the area that we're still doing well in. I'm still a relatively productive academic and a relatively productive practitioner, and yet I have to start curating new skills so that I transition smoothly. And it's the very same recipe that athletes have never found the most effective resolution to, for the most part. Most athletes have a hard time transitioning upward and then transitioning outward from sport to the next stage in their life. And why? Because they're not curating these gifts early enough, where their identity is comprised of many gifts. Some are for now, some we set aside to make room for new explorations and new curiosities and new creativity and new excitement, new growth. And that's what this book is about. It's opening up the discussion of, okay, there's a time and a place for everything, but we have to be engaged. We have to remain engaged. And how do we do that and move from one gift to the next, taking into account that giftedness and a process and a pursuit toward excellence, as Terry would say, is not a linear process. There are naysayers. There are barriers. There are people who are jealous, particularly the ones who are stalled out and not pursuing their gifts. There are time demands, family demands, the reality of financial constraints. And how do we take all of these into account and continue to grow and come up with a plan so that we are always in a state of thriving and happiness? And that's what brought me to this book. But I steeped it in transition literature. I steeped it in positive psychology literature. I steeped it in identity literature, and some of the things that I've come across that athletes have echoed time and time again to me over that 25 years.
You've given us a wonderful synopsis of the book there, Gifted, and there's lots of things you've said. There are lots of threads I can pull on, not least the importance of athletic identity, multiple identities, and the evils of identity foreclosure, which we talk a lot about, right, in sports psychology. Absolutely. But there are 8 lessons that you incorporate into this book, one of which you've spoken to quite at length there, remember your natural gifts. The thesis of this book is basically we as human beings have these natural gifts and we've got to grab hold of them. There's the second lesson here, and I think you've briefly mentioned this, but identify forces that pull you away from your gifts. Would you speak to us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, well, let's start off with what a gift is, and some of the like my early experiences in the educational setting, right through my doctorate, was comprised of people who supported me and people who really challenged me, questioned my abilities from kindergarten onward. And I speak about that. But it's funny because there was an interview with a Canadian swimmer recently, and she's the winningest, most successful Olympic medal winning athlete. Penny Alisiak, I think is her last name. And she spoke to a teacher who told her that she was wasting her time pursuing swimming. I remember being in kindergarten, and I clearly was, they thought I was learning disabled because I was so quiet, and I was a bit of a daydreamer. I was constantly daydreaming about possibilities. But even in high school, I was told I shouldn't go to university. And in university, I was told I shouldn't go to graduate school. In graduate school, I was told I wasn't good enough to complete my doctorate. And this went on and on with naysayers. And I've seen that with coaches, uh, telling that to athletes. And the thing is that we, as individuals, as people, determine our worth, and we cannot allow other people to determine it. So we know what our worth is. Other people may not see it. Look at a lot of footballers, ice hockey players, boxers, and I'm sure all of these origin stories have an element where they were told, you're not good enough. You don't have what it takes. You're different and you don't fit in. And yet, excellence comes in all shapes and sizes. So you have to identify what are your gifts. And then once you do that, the reality is there are going to be forces pulling you toward and away from those gifts. There are going to be people reinforcing it. There are going to be intuitive opportunities, experiences where things come along easily to you. And there are going to be people who are going to try to get in the way. And I've seen that oftentimes with athletes. I've experienced it in my own educational career where people have been really not very pleasant with colleagues or even with myself as a societal leader, all in all parts. But it's a common human condition to have naysayers, to have yaysayers.
I sent to my clients a wonderful clip from, I mean, you mentioned the 100 meters there, and the winner was obviously Noah Lyles, the fastest man on planet Earth right now. And there was a wonderful minute, him talking about all the things that, all the naysayers he had, which he, I mean, in
Mhm.
the end, he eventually proved them all wrong from the athletic side of things right the way through to the academic side of things, where he had a scholarship at the University of Florida. So it was absolutely fantastic to listen to. Um, Another lesson you speak about is use your gifts to respond to change in your life and remain authentic. You unpack that a little bit for us.
Well, let me just get beyond this forces. The next piece, step three in that gift process is contortions, and contortions are when you start moving away from your authentic path. And I
Yep.
think that's what you're
Yep.
talking about here. Is people know what authenticity is, and why are they unhappy when they're doing something that is misaligned with their values and their gifts? So what is the resolution is to pull yourself back. But a lot of people actually go through life soured and disenfranchised because they're misaligned. And those are oftentimes the very same people who become naysayers of other people pursuing their gifts. Why? Because oneself has not pursued one's own authentic gifts and interests and loves and passions. So this concept of contortion is important to recognize. That's also a common thing where we all fall off our path, and we have to somehow pull ourselves back onto that path. And how does that happen? Through a glimpse. And we get these glimpses over the course of a lifetime where something comes across our day where it reminds us, hey, I used to be a runner and I really enjoyed that. And that it seems to be out of my grasp right now, but I loved it. And where has that gone? Or interest in artistry or interest in music or whatever is that interest. You know what? I think I really need to find that again. I really need to find my athletic body again and return to fitness. Or, engage in a meaningful relationship, and I know what I like in the characteristics of another person, these sorts of things. And so glimpses are opportunities that come across our screen in our daily life, and yet we oftentimes usher them away, don't listen to them, and then they keep recurring every 6 months, a year, 2 years, and time is marching on.
It makes me think of the solution focused brief therapy training I've done, where you're really working hard to help people notice your strengths, notice those counters, those point where there's success stories and things that work. Just that sense of self-awareness almost, isn't it?
It is, and you have to stop. It has to give you pause. You can't just go on with your day uh, with rote practice and mindlessness and numbed out from the experiences around you. You have to be very mindful and in touch with yourself and your experiences, and what the environment is telling you, what's coming back at you from the environment. And there's some very useful information. And once you capture that glimpse and say, "Hey, I'm going to anchor to this and do something about it," that's when you start making plans, right?
And moving to lesson 5, you can use those to help you endure life's challenges, I assume. Lesson 5 is endurance.
It is endurance, and really what it is it's habit forming.
Okay.
If we want to talk about it, right, in terms of stages of change, that's really what it is. It's creating a new, healthier habit, and that takes a bit of time. And that's why it's an enduring thing. Habits fall off. We've looked at the trans theoretical model. Um, People, it's very hard to habituate something, and sometimes people relapse, and sometimes the habit doesn't stick. And you see this with runners. They go and get the shiniest, most wonderful equipment, and the first day they're really engaged. The second day it's a little bit more of a slog, and by week 2 they can't even get themselves out the door, and the shoes remain by the door, and there's all these different barriers of time and things because they're not being organized. But they're not organized because it's not part of their daily ritual, and it's not part of their daily ritual because they've yet to add meaning to it. And so the endurance is in finding that meaning and continuing on when it's a bit of a slog as you're moving towards this new gift.
And you can use these in all kinds of settings. There's a transcendence to these.
Yes, and if you endure eventually, there will be transcendence, and that can happen to you at all times in your life. I remember when I was in my 20s and winning at doing very well at international competitions and out of country, and I had these amazing performances. I never thought I would have them in my 30s, 40s, 50s. I'm heading into my 60s, and yet I've had that transcendence in public speaking. I've had it in masters running. I'm just ramping up for a marathon now, but I've won a lot of halves, not just my age group. But those transcendence opportunities happen as a result of the endurance of putting one foot in front of the proverbial other until it becomes easier, and then you flourish again. Now you're thriving again. You're at that stage where you're on your authentic path and you're doing it full force.
And it feels kind of fitting that you've finished the book on lesson 8, regifting. I say fitting because cultural psychology has played such a big part in your career. And when we think of cultural psychology, we might think of that more collectivist environment rather than the individual. Regifting is very much helping others find their gifts.
Yeah, and as an educator, I try to believe that that is the right thing to do. And when I'm working with athletes, I talk to them about regifting and toying with that early enough so that's part of their mentality, so that when they can no longer be the boxer or the runner or the ice hockey player, that they can do something else. They have more to offer. They have a degree of knowledge. I like the educator piece. I like sitting in the classroom. A lot of researchers say that they want to do bench research. I like the educational piece because I engage with people and I see the next generation and I get them going in new research and in new practice. And that's part of what each one of us should do. A bit of a shout out, though, is you're right. I do a lot of my research. If you look at the more recent work on ResearchGate, with the Asian community, where it is highly collectivistic. I'm working with athletes who reside in Taipei, in Beijing, in Tokyo, and there's a lot of consideration of the people around oneself and bestowing gifts and not shaming them. And yet, in universities here in the West, I see sometimes professors who are leading classes where they're not happy teaching and they don't give fully of themselves and they don't give graciously of themselves. And if they do that, what kind of model are they setting for the next generation? What teaching are they providing? Is that it's all about me and my research and until I'm done, and then I'm going to move on to the next stage of my life. And but what about the generativity in the next, we talk about generativity and despair, right? And what about that? What about what is self-actualization, and really what can we offer other people in the next generation to make a better civilization and a better society?
Well, with that question in mind and putting you slightly on the spot, we'll give our listeners an idea of where they can purchase your new book. But I'd love to close out by, as I say, putting you slightly on the spot. You have many, many years of competing yourself, working with some of the finest athletes on the planet, and developing elite athletes as well across many different cultures. So what would be your top three, or just three, tips, hints, tricks, concepts, philosophies for those listening in around any subject on sports psychology? It could be participative, it could be competitive, it could be learning. What would be the top three things that you would want to say to the audience listening in?
Yeah, I would say there are a couple of anchors that I think that are really important. One of them is taking into account who you are and who the person is you're working with and converging with them and making that effort as opposed to distilling skills. We are all knowledgeable in our respective areas. Athletes are, coaches are. And so this understanding of identity is so needed, because if you don't understand identity, how can you help someone bring their identity onto the world stage and have it shine? And what a sadness is if someone is competing and they can't exhibit their identity as part of their performance. So that would be one right off the top. Another one is this concept of transition and really understanding that change is inevitable. And in each one of us, we need to continuously change and reinvent ourselves. And reinventing is an important part of an athlete's career, a coach's career, a sport manager's career, a sponsor's career, a practitioner's career, an educator's career, and a researcher's career, and a person's, more generally, a family member's career. We've got to continuously reinvent ourselves to maintain that excitement and engagement with the society around us. And if we can't do it ourselves, how in God's name are we going to teach it to someone else? The third one, I guess, would be this importance of mental health and looking at the excellence of sport, not just as podium and podium plus, but as holism. And excellence and the extraordinary transcends an outcome and transcends a series of outcomes. Though we value outcomes such as medals, and people are excited with medals and really disappointed when they finish fourth at the Olympics sometimes, and that's known to be true in the research, is that we are these are opportunities for us to thrive, and we have to look more carefully at thinking about how are we going to help our clients flourish in the ring, beyond the ring, in their lives, and how are we going to do the same by example? So I guess those would be uh, three pieces. I think also people need to be evidence based in the work that they do and not approximate. And I've always felt that in my own research that a lot of my practice has been driven by the clients around me and then the systematic investigations that have led to interventions. So that's another piece to the puzzle, I think.
Brilliant. Rob, thank you so much for this. This is absolutely fascinating. I really can't thank you enough. You've been very generous with your time. How can people, first and foremost, get hold of this book of yours, Gifted, and how can people find you, follow you, and get in contact?
Yeah, Gifted in Canada, they're selling it across the country in indigo. It can be found on Amazon, in the US on Barnes and Noble. It's carried by Human Kinetics publishers. The publisher has now delved into motivational books, and they're wonderful for any author who's thinking about doing a motivational book. I've had a great experience with them. But you could find it on their website in the UK, in Asia, in South America, in North America, Australia. Worldwide, you can access the Human Kinetics website. I've got an Instagram account at Rob J. Schinke. Uh, so that can be found as well, and then various keynotes along the way as well. And I work out at Laurentian University in Canada.
Rob, thank you so much for today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions you might have for me. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.